book was called Weapons of Math Destruction, and the subtitle was How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. And I think since it was published 4 years ago, before the election of Donald Trump, I think both of those things have been pretty well played out. My personal experience was I was a trained mathematician. I was a professor of mathematics. Then I became a quant in finance and like witnessed the financial crash. And in particular, I witnessed the extent to which that algorithms, and especially the mortgage-backed security risk rating algorithms, those AAA ratings, really pumped up the housing market, gave people false trust, and then actually like exploded it in a way that was extra destructive. I then became a data scientist, and I realized, oh wait, I'm also screwing the world now, even though I thought I was going to get my hands clean. Working as a data scientist, I realized that I was basically, I was bifurcating the world on the internet anyway, into people that deserve stuff and people that didn't deserve stuff. I'll just start there. Like, there's a lot of things I could say, but like, I was basically saying, people like you are lucky, I will give you opportunities. People like you are unlucky, I will deny you those opportunities. And I saw this in particular as a way of increasing inequality, because the more I looked, the more I found that algorithms were everywhere. And so people who just did stuff like me, which is essentially everyone, were going to do this. They were going to make lucky people luckier and unlucky people unluckier. So that was my inequality side of things. And then on the other side, the democracy side, I was an early observer of the micro-targeting in political campaigns with Obama stuff. I sat next to, like, I had dinner once with a guy who was making a lot of money with micro-targeted political campaign ads, which is to say, to be clear, was doing the same stuff I was doing, sort of scoring people on various political issues, on their persuadability, on what is the most important thing to you? So like, basically, like, they knew more about you than you knew about them. And that was going to be true even if you like left Facebook. And I challenged this guy on the effect this kind of thing has on democracy. And his answer to me was like, oh, but our side is better at it, so it's okay. And I was like, no, that's actually a terrible answer, and it's also wrong. And like, that was right before the election. So it's just so short-sighted. It's but I guess to finally answer your question, Yasha, like, the reason I'm pessimistic, and I am, although I'm not entirely hopeless, the reason I'm pessimistic is that these things require a lot of resources to build, data, technology resources. They're deployed by powerful people for their own objectives. And for the most part, people who are subject to these scoring systems have no way to fight back.
So, that's a great set of points. And I'm starting to be hopeful that there will be real disagreement, because in my mind, even though you focus on slightly different topics to Martin, you're emphasizing the ways in which tech actually ultimately reinforces hierarchy. That you need a lot of resources in order to deploy these targeted ads, for example.
Yes.
That you need a lot of resources in order to have access to all of that data. And so even though it might seem that tech is giving tools to the powerless, to people who are outside of those institutions, outside of those corporations, outside of those political parties, actually that's not the case. And Martin, I think in your work, you very much come from the other direction. You very much say that the world used to be run by these hierarchical institutions that had a huge advantage over others for various reasons, including information. And that the democratization of information on the internet and the ease with which people can now organize protests actually really makes these institutions paper tigers, makes them completely subject to these amorphous pressures from different kind of self-constituting groups that might take them on. So how much do you disagree with Kathy, and what do you think the relevance, the impact of what you call in your book the revolt of the public might be?
Well, I'm remembering my days in high school, and there is no way I'm ever going to disagree with a professor of mathematics. Okay. So there's that. Secondly, I'm almost always typecast as the dark, gloomy prophet of pessimism. And I don't know what the heck has happened with the world, but here I am, suddenly representing the optimistic side.
I always took you to be optimistic. Perhaps it's just you're optimistic compared to me.
I'm actually not an optimist. I am not a pessimist. I'm an analyst. And from that perspective, to vastly simplify your question, which is, of course, a good way to answer it, I I think what's significant, what's important is not whether, for example, information technology is beneficial or harmful to our democratic institutions, but whether those institutions are adapted to the world, to the environment as it actually exists today. I don't think there's any question that they're not adapted, they're totally maladapted. And I think information technology plays probably the vast majority of the reason for why that maladaptation has happened. That's my theme, that's my framework. So then the second question you have to ask is, so what do? Do you put information technology in some sort of like Procrustean bed and chop off all the bits that offend institutional actors? You know, the fact that you can be herded by algorithms, the fact that you can be, you have, you're given a capacity to unknown actors to voice taboo opinions and even falsehoods. Should all that be chopped off? Or conversely, should we reform or seek to reform our democratic institutions so that they're back in the conversation, which they are not today? I agree with what you said. It was a good characterization of my position. I feel like they have been swept off. And many of the individual players, Trump on Twitter, for example, actually part of the conversation, but as individual players, the institutions themselves are not part of the conversation. So the question is, you know, should we reform them so that they actually are adapted to the world as it is and can take advantage, much less just be there, take advantage of the digital universe to maybe make the world a little more democratic? I, of course, believe that's the way to go. I sometimes get asked, well, what would you do? And I'm not a prophet of any kind. I don't have a bag in my pocket that I can take out full of solutions. But the fact is, unless we talk about reform, it's not going to happen. And nobody is talking about reform. You have, in the coming elections, you have a candidate of disruption and a candidate of reaction. You do not have a candidate of reform, as I understand the term.
Martin,
So,
what does reform mean to you?
Yeah, it does not mean what usually modern government means it to be, which is create a, you know, if the public is angry, let's create a gigantic agency of the public to make them happy. I think you have to get deep into the reasons why these institutions are in trouble and why the fact that the public has access to information has basically shaken their legitimacy and their authority. And part of the reason is the distance between the top and the bottom. I mean, it's a huge, enormous distance. These institutions were forged way back in the early 20th century on basically industrial principles. We're in an entirely different world today. And I think there is no reason for the institution. I mean, if you count the layers between you and Donald Trump, I don't even know how many dozens or hundreds of layers there are, right? It wasn't that long ago that Teddy Roosevelt was standing in the front of the White House after his reelection, shaking the hands of anybody who came by. Okay, this is a very relatively sudden, historical terms, steep rise in the pyramid of government, which, whatever way you want to play it, makes it less democratic. I'll stop.
Well, I have a follow-up question to you, Martin, but then I'd love to go back to Kathy, which is, isn't part of what happens on social media and the internet for that you do get a very, very flattened hierarchy, right? That, you know, Donald Trump tweets something, if I have the right kind of response, just as many people might see my response as what he tweeted. And in fact, he often ends up elevating random private citizens, often ones that you might think an American president should not, in fact, elevate in that manner, by randomly coming across their tweets and retweeting them, right? And people who have 50 followers on Twitter who suddenly are being exposed to a huge audience because the president of the United States, on the spur of a moment, decides, boom, retweet. So you know, sure, Teddy Roosevelt stood there and sort of shook people's hands. All right, great. So perhaps people got 2 seconds of an interaction with him. Was that so much less hierarchical than what we're seeing on social media today?
The question is whether the past was more hierarchical than it was in social media today. No, I mean, there's always hierarchy, okay? The idea that we live in a flat world is bogus. That can never be. There's a power curve that pretty much drives all human behavior. The question is, how steep is it? How steep is it? And I think for various reasons in the 20th century, when basically hundreds of millions of people entered history for the first time. I mean, these were individuals who lived outside the margins of history. They were organized in these massive organizations, institutions, and the idea was you could control them from the top. These have been tinkered with and improved since then, but the basic principle is the same. And I think social media is different in the sense that when I was a young man, many, many moons ago, if I wanted to have my opinion in public, I had to write a letter to the editor or have a publisher who was my friend. That was the only way I could do it. The Revolt of the Public, I basically wrote and heaved onto Amazon as an ebook. It got picked up by Stripe Press because they liked it, because Trump kind of liked it. I'm a Trump profiteer. It entered the printing world that way. I would not have had any of those possibilities when I was a young man. I needed access to power to get to the top of the hierarchy, whichever institution I was in. This is not just about government; it's about every institution. And to get there, you needed, accreditation. You needed mentors. You needed to jump through a lot of hoops. And then you were in a position where you could turn around and now you were the voice. You were the public voice that everybody else had to listen to. But so in that regard, it's not that it's less hierarchical, but the information is way, way larger. The number of voices is vastly increased. That makes it in some ways more chaotic. I don't think there's any question of that. But human arrangements are always hierarchical.
So, Kathy, I would have to get your response to the overall direction from which Martin is coming at this here, right? Where I think the idea is overall that something about social media and something about the internet is decentering these old institutions. And that whereas you worry that it's simply allowing them to have even more control, it makes it much harder for those who are powerful to actually manage the people who might criticize them, the people who might rebel against them. So is there something, despite some of the tendencies you describe, is there something hopeful about tech? Is there actually a real prospect with or without reform that it might allow people to take on those institutions?
Just to be honest, I have like 4 different reactions to Martin's words. I mean, the first one I'd say is like, I'm not so sure about the whole like gatekeeper thing. Sorry. I've just been getting spam all day. Like I have a PhD from Harvard in mathematics. That's why I got a foot in the door for publishing my book. Like I did a very standard old-fashioned thing. And I have to say that as like a woman, the fact that I have this PhD in mathematics is a gatekeeping pass, as is being a published author. I think these are things that are old-fashioned and still true. Now, I do think that there's more stuff happening, but I also kind of disagree that it's flat at all. So, I mean, I do think that the structure has changed, but I think that the new power is more of a statistical power than a like gatekeeper, like 5 o'clock news type, Tom Brokaw type of power, which was like very, very, very clear and transparent. Like they got to decide what was newsworthy. Nowadays, it's crazy, but it is not random. It is controlled by people who have figured out the game. And like, that's why I mentioned the, the people from Obama Analytics, because they were some of the original ones that figured out the game. But since then, like, propagandists have done very, very well, and people who control bot armies have done very well. That's power. That is power, because that gets attention. And it's a statistical game now, because you are gaming the system. You're gaming the attention machine. But you can do that with statistical methodologies that I learned and I invented. So it's real, and it costs money, by the way. So it's the same game. And in some sense, it's just like, who has money, who has time, who has resources, they have the power. And that is really scary. And to the point of Martin, of like sort of standard old-fashioned power structures, like government for that matter, not having control over the platforms, absolutely. But that just means the platforms have power instead of the government officials. It doesn't mean that we, the people, have power. It means that the power is now in Zuckerberg's hand and Jeff Bezos's hands. And that's not better, because they're not even elected. We can't get rid of them.
But perhaps just to follow up on that, I mean, I wonder whether that depends on what exactly we mean by power, right? So they have a lot of money and
yep.
so on. It's not clear to me they have a lot of power over what happens on their platforms. I mean, today Twitter, appended a notice on one of Trump's tweets that it's untruthful or misleading. That's not really going to stop that tweet from getting spread more. In fact,
they don't really want to stop that tweet from getting spread more, Yasha. That's how they make money.
Yeah, it's not clear to me for what those platforms can do to truly change the nature of a conversation. They started to simply censor what the president of the United States says. The president would find other ways of communicating with the public, and it would be damaging to the platform. So, I don't know. Do you think that if, what could Twitter do on something like that if it really said, we don't like Trump and we want to make sure that his damaging messages don't get to the public? Like, what would they do, and how would that play out? I'm always a little bit skeptical about the things that people suggest in that, because it seems to me like actually in the end they don't quite have the power.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. I will argue the following: they don't have control. They definitely don't have scrupulous control like we used to see over media, for example, but they do have power. So they have the power to redesign their websites. They have the power to change the bias in their underlying algorithms. They have the power to change the objective function for the Facebook newsfeed algorithm, which currently is optimized to keeping us on Facebook, which privileges like arguments rather than agreements. There's a lot of power there. I agree that it's not complete control. And if they had surgical control over things, that would be a totally different world. We don't live in that world. So the surgical control is gone. And I agree with Martin that it is much more chaotic, but they still have power, and they have more power than seemingly the government does. And one of the things that my pet peeves along these lines is what you think is a low-hanging fruit, but happens to be seemingly impossible, is that algorithms in all sorts of industries like credit, insurance, the justice system, are actually just illegal. They're just simply bypassing laws that exist. And I'm not talking about sort of like, what should we do? What should like Twitter or Facebook do? What should we do with Section 230 or any kind of abstract conversation about new laws? I'm talking about existing laws. They are bypassing those laws, and nobody can seem to stop them because nobody can seem to understand them. So to that point, like, I would argue that and see what Martin thinks, is that the way I see algorithms and technology as a whole is a sort of layers, puts another layer, and maybe a Martin layer, if I understood his layers, another quite thick, hard to penetrate layer in between any individual and people who are actually in charge. And somehow that is not just a bug, but a feature of that algorithmic layer, is that it's sort of a mechanism of bypassing accountability for the people who use and deploy them.
Martin.
Yeah, can I talk to that?
Please.
Yeah, I actually don't disagree with you. I'm sorry to say, Yasha.
You shall disagree. I will find a point of disagreement before this conversation.
You are the devil's advocate. I am on record as saying that rather than try and regulate or put these silly comments like that Twitter does on Trump's bizarre tweets. Um, it, what we should be asking is some sort of, I mean, some sort of accountability. And it's a fine line. I know that these algorithms are the family jewels for these enormous corporations. That's how they make their big money. But there are ways in which you can say, and should be able to say, and should be compelled to say, in general, this is what my algorithm does. I'm not going to tell you any secrets. Most of us, anyway, if you gave us the math, we would probably fall asleep. But certainly, in terms of, you know, if you say the word Nazi or something, suddenly you're going to find 10 persons who are not real Nazis. There ought to be a way of accountability, the same way that, and that is where I think democracy is infinitely superior to this internet world. I mean, no matter how broken our system is, if you're a politician, you have to give an account for yourself. You propose something, and then you have to give an account for yourself. And, you know, you see poor Mark Zuckerberg, who of all that crowd actually is probably the guy that I respect the most, because he's like Hamlet, you know, he's like, to be or not to be. He's really trying, you know, and he's not, I mean, he's trying. I mean, you can tell he really is trying. But I mean, they're pulling him from each arm and from each leg, and some people want him to basically control, you know, fake news that might reelect Trump. Some people want him to stop discriminating against conservatives. Everybody thinks that he is the villain, and everybody wants him to change everything so that they gain an advantage of this enormous platform. This is global, the greatest platform that has ever been in the history of the human race. But I don't think you can, if you can just elaborate, okay, this is when you come to Facebook, your ideas and your discussion is going to be shaped in this direction. We're not neutral. We're pushing you in certain directions, which are commercial, which are just ideas. Then they can be held accountable to that. You know, all it takes is a little statement. This is what my algorithms do to you when you come in here. This is what you are signing on to when you come through the door.
Yeah, so we found our disagreement. I think we nailed it here.
Hureka, please explain it to us.
Yeah.
So first of all, Zuckerberg is a liar. He's a straight up liar. He lied to Congress multiple times, basically arguing that AI is going to fix misinformation problems. And it's not, because AI doesn't have a model of the truth. That is just a lie, and he knows it. He's smart enough to know that's a lie. And it's embarrassing to me that the Congress people did not object to it. But that's what it is. That is the layer. That's the layer I was talking about. People are intimidated by this stuff because they think they don't have a PhD, so they don't have the right to push back.
Yeah, since I don't have a PhD in that, at least, I do have a useless PhD in political theory. When you're saying that AI doesn't have a model of a truth, that means that AI can't fix misinformation.
Yes.
Just take
elaborate
us for a minute.
Yeah, so AI has a model of Go and of checkers and of chess. That's why AI is really good at those games. It's a toy little universe with all the rules very, very well spelled out. It's completely clear who has won, and it's completely clear what the goal is, which is to win. And because it's so trivial in a certain sense, it's so closed and so tiny, it is open and shut. In the real world, it is not clear what it means to win or lose. It's not clear what is a truth, what is political, what is historical fact or fiction. If we can't, let me put it this way, if we can't decide it, if we can't agree on it, and there are plenty of gray areas on this stuff, if we can't figure that out, then why would an algorithm, an AI figure that out, which doesn't understand English? It just, or for that matter, all the other languages on Facebook. So that's a totally different issue, but it is an important one that Zuckerberg was pushing under the rug. We simply don't have it. And I don't have a proof that we won't have it in 25 years, but we don't have it now. And his argument that AI would fix misinformation problems, which really he said was a lie. And that's why I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. But having said that, you brought up another thing about Facebook. Oh yes, you said that, like, if an explanation for the algorithm were available that would help. I don't think that would help. There is an let me give you an example. There is an explanation for something on Facebook. It's the why am I seeing this ad feature. You can click on it. It says, why am I seeing this ad? And it's bullshit. It's complete bullshit. And I could have told you it would have been bullshit because as a hedge fund quant, I learned how to be full of shit. And I could have told you that like an explanation could literally be anything. It doesn't have to be useful in particular. When we think of it, something like an explanation, we always think the most important thing that would be interesting or surprising to me. But an explanation really isn't that. So like, for example, let's say you have a alternative credit company that decides to extend credit to somebody based on their FICO score, their zip code, their race, and their latest tweet. And they deny someone credit. By the way, that's illegal, what I just described, right? They just have denied someone credit, but there's a restriction that they have to explain that they have to explain the denial of credit, which actually there is a law saying that. They don't do it with alternative credit algorithms, but there is a law saying that. That's one of the laws that they are not enforcing in the age of algorithms. But the explanation could always just be your FICO score was too low. It could just always be that. Like I could set up an algorithm so that that is always the explanation, because at some level, with this race and this zip code and this tweet that you just ran, there is some FICO score that would give you that loan, but you didn't have that FICO score. Do you see what I'm saying? So explanations are never going to be a panacea, because explanations can be unimportant. You're not getting at the critical information, which is how is this predatory, or how is this what I don't want? Like the question that we're trying to really get at, Martin, I would argue, is not what is this algorithm?
I
Go ahead, Martin.
I think you might be stuck.
Yeah, I think we may have lost Martin for a minute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Am I back?
You are.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, but perhaps
Okay,
you can't
good.
hear me.
Sorry. Yeah, I keep getting an internet. I see you.
All right, why don't we do this?
But you're
I
frozen.
have a final question, and then I want to get everybody in from the audience. And let's start with Kathy, and hopefully Martin's internet will be better in a minute. Which is, all right, so I understand some of the pitfalls and some of the problems that we face, and what you wrote about in the Weapons of Mass Destruction, Kathy. What do we do? Martin said reform, and I'll press him in a minute on what he means by reform. What do you think we can do? Is there anything we can do, or is it just that inherently the internet favors those with money and power so much that there isn't very much what we can do to change that?
Oh, I do think we want reform. That's why I asked Martin to clarify what he meant by reform. Martin, are you back? I sort of feel like you can, maybe not.
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
By reform? Is that what we're talking about here?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I number one, I think I made it clear. I think government needs to be leaner. There's no need for us to have an industrial-based government in the digital age. I think, I mean, when you look at, I'm going to use the tech as a positive example, since I'm supposed to be the optimist. Can you hear me? I can keep asking. Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you. Keep going.
Damn. You can hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so when you look at Amazon is an enormous bureaucracy, a gigantic bureaucracy. God knows how many people are grinding away in it. What you experience as a customer is excellent and low expense service, okay? When you take a government bureaucracy, you flip that around. Government delivers an enormous amount of services, an enormous amount. But what you experience is process, bureaucracy. You have to fill out the form. You have 20 different numbers that you're supposed to remember yourself by. The little country of Estonia, that you can't push that one too far because it's a very small country, 1 million. They have digitized. Everybody has one number, and they can vote. They can vote digitally if they want to. They can essentially participate in everything they want digitally. It's a step. I mean, I feel like there are several layers to this. I think as long as we are divided, which we are, having cosmic federal, and I think the more that we create solutions that can be tailored to localities, that restore some trust in democratic government. So I mean, I don't claim to have the final solution here, but I mean, those are the directions that I would go in.
Kathy, is that broadly the same direction where you'd go in? Would you go further? Do you disagree on any of those points?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Martin just said is sort of an argument for nationalizing Amazon, which I hope we do.
Well, the Amazon should nationalize the government.
Or maybe a merger.
Yeah, right. Hostile.
Although I do, yeah, I mean, I hope the workers would be well paid. I guess what I mean, I share Martin's despair with the ineffectiveness of the government in the current age. I personally started a company to audit algorithms, and my original goal was to be hired by the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which Elizabeth Warren started and which has been absolutely destroyed under Trump. So now I'm working for the Massachusetts Attorney General at the state level, Illinois Attorney General, like trying to help them think through what would it mean to enforce laws in the age of the algorithm. And I'm doing it in a very lightweight way. It doesn't require the servers that Google has, for example, to start enforcing some laws. But yeah, it's a question of like, can we even get that done? I'm not sure. We certainly can't get it done when the whole point of the debate is like QAnon. That is, it's more than a distraction. It is like, it's at this point become the thing. And it's like, if we can't even trust our own postal service, I don't know how we're going to trust any regulator to regulate an algorithm that it's actually quite hard to understand. So it is a little bit like I don't want to be totally pessimistic because I do have a path that I'm working on personally that I think is a potential way of addressing at least some of these things. But the bigger problems of misinformation and conspiracy theory and just a bad, terrible conversation, I don't know how to address. I'm going to be honest with you.
I feel like the internet, we deliberately arranged for Martin's Wi-Fi to be somewhat disrupted because we wanted to illustrate the simultaneous promise and perils of the internet. I hear, together
Totally.
from across the country and the world to follow this debate, and we can stream it live on YouTube with a lot of viewers, and so all of that stuff. But at the same time, we can't hear each other because the damn Wi-Fi signal isn't strong enough. So I think that tells something about the promise and the perils. I'd really love to get some questions from the audience because I know that there's a lot of people who know as much about tech as Kathy and Martin, and certainly more than me in the audience. So why don't you raise your hands and I will jump to anybody who wants to come in. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know what Kathy thinks about what she called the age of the algorithm. Do you think that it's really the age of the algorithm, or like I would argue that it's more the age of centralization, and that even if it wasn't kind of inscrutable algorithms running Facebook or these other platforms, the fact that it's centralized, they can control everything. There's very little recourse that we have. Even if they were using internally scrutable algorithms, it seems more like centralization than rather algorithms themselves are the problem to me.
So I would agree with you at the level of social media. And part of that is that like there's that network effect where it doesn't make sense to be on a social media unless your friends are on it. So you're going to have a lot of attention, and it's going to be centralized by the nature of a successful media platform, social media platform. But I would say the opposite is true in many other industries. Like if I keep on going to the credit industry, but let me stay there. There's just a ton of startups that all are like, we're going to use alternative data to decide who deserves a credit card loan or other loan, mortgage, whatever. They're all tiny, and you can start one yourself tomorrow, Sam, if you had an investment in a startup from some venture capitalists. And guess what? Like, here's something that they don't want you to know. They're all doing basically the same thing, like with basically the same kind of data. Maybe they have this company has a slightly different set of data, and they have a slightly newer technique of building algorithms, but they're basically all doing the same thing. And then they eventually, if they're successful or they're just a little bit more profitable or less legal or both, then some of their other startup competitors will be bought by a bank who likes to keep their liability at arm's length. So the bank won't actually internalize that algorithm, but it'll invest in a startup that does that kind of thing, because they think that they are not going to themselves get in trouble for that, which they're probably right. But the point is that, like, there's dozens of these different companies that are essentially all doing the same thing. And it's because that is the nature of data science, if you don't mind me saying. Like, it's the nature of data. Like, we can pick up gender, we can pick up race, we can pick up class, we can pick up income and wealth markers. We can say, how much have you bought from fancy stores in the past? That's all available on all Americans. So we can pick up on enough signals so that we can decide. Or we could say, are you friends with somebody who's rich? Are you friends with somebody, or are you friends with people who have been arrested? Like, we can profile people up the wazoo, and that's what all these companies are doing. So profiling is something like, is the centralization, if you will, Sam. The centralization is happening in the data itself, in the data and the data techniques. The algorithms, though, are separate, and they're in different companies, and they're not centralized.
Sam, do you have any follow-up on that?
No, I'm okay with that, I think.
Great, so let's go to DJ.
DJ is muted.
Yeah, I just tried to unmute him.
Sorry, for some reason my mouse was not working. So first of all, this is a great conversation, and thank you both for coming on. And I'm not sure this is exactly parallel to what you've been talking about, but one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, you mentioned nationalization of Amazon. I think that would be very challenging for a lot of reasons, but I think there probably is room for nationalization of certain types of IT infrastructure. I mean, the obvious point is something like broadband, but I'm thinking in particular, for example, the way states handle voting now, right? We give them complete and total authority, which is as it should be, you know, it's constitutional, but that means you've got 50 different attack vectors for hostile powers, for them to manipulate IT and voting tolls. And, you know, the thing about a company like Google or Facebook is they have an army of some of the best engineers in the entire world who focus on countering those kinds of threats. And you're just not going to see that, you know, at the typical IT department of a medium-sized state. And I wonder to what degree, you know, that problem can be remedied, and maybe in the process, someone just posted, don't trust us with Google voting infrastructure, maybe so, but I'll still trust you more than I would trust, let's say, the IT department at the state of Delaware. So I guess I'm just wondering, is there a path forward that involves kind of fixing the infrastructure, and that lays the groundwork for more improvements beyond that? And that's my question.
Kathy, Martin, Ava, you want to respond to that?
No, that's way over my pay grade. The only thing I would say is nationalizing anything in a moment where government is so intensely distrusted is probably a bad move. At Google, I'm with the guy, the chatter, who said that we shouldn't put our voting in their hands. And thirdly, I would say that I am, having worked at CIA, I guess I would have to be shot if I spoke them. I would say that a lot of disinformation is intent without effect. In other words, they do things. There's no question about it. They're in there, but the effect is practically no. So I would be happy leaving the states in charge.
Great. Karen.
Hi, great conversation. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I got my head. Okay. I was curious what you thought about the probability of prosocial uses of algorithms in data science. So, for example, we have these government interventions happening, in my understanding, based on fairly little data. So we're like using instruments like an axe when we could use a scalpel. So is there? I mean, can these be used in a prosocial way, or are they just too? Is the danger for abuse just too great to use them?
I'll jump on that if you don't mind, because I wrote a piece just a couple of weeks ago suggesting a prosocial way of using crime risk scores. Crime risk scores are currently used in almost all states to decide who gets parole and whether you're going to get, how long you'll be sentenced and whether you'll be incarcerated pre-trial if you end up in front of a judge. And they are basically algorithms that they're not just basically, they are algorithms that are optimized to predict whether you will be arrested in the future. So as you can imagine, if you look into how they actually work, you'll find a lot of really curious things. So for example, if you have an addiction, you'll be very likely to be predictably arrested. So there's two parts to that. You'll be arrested because we criminalize addiction, and it's predictable because guess what? Addiction is predictable. Similarly with health risks, like mental health problems, if you have a mental health problem, your risk goes up. It is predictable that you will continue to have a mental health risk problem and that the police will arrest you in the future. If you live in a poor Black neighborhood, you will predictably be rearrested. And I'm saying this in a particular way because none of these things, in my opinion, are really exposing underlying criminality in the way we think about it. Certainly not violent criminality, but it is in fact how these algorithms get optimized and they get trained. And so my argument was, instead of punishing people for being people who look like people who got arrested in the past and therefore might very likely get arrested in the future, which is what we're doing. Because if you have a high risk score, by the way, you get sentenced to longer and you get denied parole and you get denied freedom before trial. So we are punishing people for looking like people who were arrested in the past by police. Well, we could be doing something else. We could be saying, oh, that's a way to defund the police, if you will. That's a way to say, why is it that we arrest people with mental health problems and addiction problems to such a higher degree? How do we change that? And where should the money go instead of to the police? So that was my argument for how to defund the police using an algorithm, which is to flip the algorithm as a mirror onto us rather than as a punishment tool.
So I suppose there's two different things here I'm trying to puzzle out, right? Like one is that we believe that you shouldn't be punished because some ascriptive characteristic you have is shared with other people who are statistically more likely, or have historically been statistically more likely to engage in a certain kind of behavior, right? So we don't want car insurance companies to be able to say, because your demographic group has higher accident rates, we're going to give you a sort of higher rate or something like that. And what's interesting about algorithms is that often through the back door, they sort of reintroduce that, right? Because it's not explicitly, this is sort of our table and that adds for $17 a month onto your bill, but that is in the background what the algorithm is doing. And so it's flouting a set of laws that are there for sort of good normative reasons, right? But it sounds to me like in what you just said was a little bit of a jump towards a different thing, right? Which is that it may in fact be that certain features you have are associated with committing crimes, for example, right? But when you suffer from a certain kind of mental illness, you are more likely to commit a certain kind of crime. Now, I think the conversation about how to deal with that is very, very complicated. And certainly when we recognize that one of the reasons why somebody commits those crimes is mental illness, it calls into doubt whether prison is the right response and so on. But that does seem like it's a relevant, right? I mean, I don't think we quite get to, therefore we shouldn't be arresting them when they commit those crimes. That seems a little bit too simple, right? Because here we're not talking about the case of just predicting on the basis of behaviors of others. What is revealing about this person may be relevant to our treatment of them, but in a more complicated way.
mean, we could talk for an entire hour about this, to be honest. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that like having a mental health problem in itself is not a crime, but that is in fact how often people are treated who have mental health problems. So I would say like we first have to separate or decouple, if you will, the way police deal with actual crimes and the way they deal with things like nuisances of people who have problems. And if we did that, Yasha, then I would say, okay, so we don't arrest people for mental health problems, but people with this particular mental health problem tend to do this crime more often. Then I'd be ready for that conversation. But we're not there yet because we actually do arrest people because they are mentally ill.
I think there's clearly many cases of that, and so far as that's the case, I completely agree with you. Let's go to Yuval.
Right. So, question to Kathy about your venture of improving enforcement of laws that are bypassed. Could you speak about that, both examples of the laws and how you're addressing them?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, when I first started my company right before the election, I was planning to work for regulators as a consultancy. It's still a consultancy, but I haven't had that many clients that are regulators at any type, although I'm starting to pick them up now. So I've been working with private clients, and so I've signed NDAs for the most part. I can't talk too much about them, but I'll say that they're all over the place. Anytime you have a company that gets into a lot of public problems with an algorithm that ends up being like outrageous in one way or another, they're probably going to start worrying about like, can they keep using this? Often they don't contact me. I'm not saying that I have that many clients, but I do have some clients like that. The one I'm allowed to talk about is actually the Washington State Department of Licensing. So that's like the DMV of Washington State. And they use facial recognition in their licensing issuance. And they use it as a way of deciding whether someone is trying to get a second ID with the same person is trying to get a second ID. So it's sort of like a fraud check. And it's actually one of the things I found really fascinating about that job was like, it turns out that's, I'm sure you guys I've heard about all the pushes to ban facial recognition because of its underlying problems, which it does have. And that has been successful in some cities and towns all across the country, especially on the coasts. But what I've realized doing this work is that it would never actually work at a state level, at least until there's an act of Congress, because in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack, Congress passed something called the Real ID Act, which essentially made it a requirement that all DMVs in every state use facial recognition and guarantee that like one person, it's called one person, one ID, that each person has exactly one ID and not more than one ID. I'm getting a little bit off track, Yuval, but I hope this is interesting to you as it is to me. The consequence of this is like, not only are they required to use facial recognition to check for fraud, but they're also required to share that data with the FBI and other federal agents. So that's really, really interesting. And I think people do not really quite understand how sort of intrinsic facial recognition has become in sort of, and I'm sure you guys know that the Real ID stuff for your license, like if you want to get on an airplane, that's the risk, by the way. Like if states refuse to do that, if they say, no, we're not using facial recognition because we find it problematic or whatever, then their citizens won't be able to get on an airplane pretty soon. So it's a pretty big leverage. So they asked us to help them think through like whether they're working hard enough to mitigate the problems of the underlying facial recognition software. And the short version is we said they are. Like they have many layers, impressive layers of human oversight that really mitigates the flaws of the underlying problem, so that it's known that facial recognition doesn't work as well for Black people, for women, and for older people. And so they have all these checks and balances, human beings, that make sure that those people are not unduly harmed by the flaws of the underlying algorithm.
That's fascinating. I'd heard that for ethnic minorities, particularly Black people, it's often that's good at facial recognition. I think I'd heard this about women. I hadn't heard about older people, which is a sort of strange category. I wonder why that is. Whether that's also because there's like
people's faces change a lot when they grow. I mean, grow older. And in Washington State, actually, it's not as big a deal because you're required to take a new picture every few years. But in other states, I imagine that there's a real problem that like 10 years later,
right.
you do not look the same.
That makes sense. All right, great. Alex.
Great, thank you for the discussion. I think it's very important to have this discussion. I don't see it enough. So I'm also a mathematician, so I studied non-parametric Bayesian stuff and kind of got seduced into the world of the Googles and stuff due to the amount of data they had, and sort of blindly worked at my mathematical projects without even thinking of the consequences. And suddenly I awoke and was quite scared of what we were doing. So my question is really on sort of correlation and causation. So in both Kathy, your book, and then also in another book by Professor Eubank on automating inequality, we're starting to see that, there's a lot of discussion around social media, but predictive decision making is also happening in areas that are traditionally serving the more of the impoverished demographic. So things like social services, law enforcement, healthcare, and so forth. And we're using these systems to do complex decision making. As a researcher, I know how little we actually know about these models. And particularly when, we start to get into these deeper models that, are non-convex and we don't have any clue what the hell is going on. There's massive optimization problems in high dimensional spaces. How important is it for us as researchers to disclose the limitations of our predictive models and start working towards other things? So like right now we're doing a lot of work in causal inference and so forth. We used big data, but this is just observational data. These are just correlations. And, we know from research as well, things like shortcut learning, for example, where a system will learn a background of an image instead of the actual image. So if you put a cow in a street, for example, it won't know how to recognize. So I'm having difficulty discussing this with representatives, discussing this with policymakers. So I'm curious if you guys have any ideas of how, as a researcher, we can be more accountable and share this information.
I will start, but Martin, I'm going to give it to you afterwards. I'll say that as a hedge fund quant, I realized that if you get it right 51% of the time, you make money. And I was like, that's a pretty low bar. You just have to be slightly better than random. But like when you move to deciding who gets a loan, who gets a job, obviously the standards must be much higher. And what I realized is no, there are no standards. There are absolutely no standards. The standards are, does this make money for me, essentially? And then I'm hoping to introduce the standards of, is it overtly racist, or is it overtly punishing of a protected class? And by the way, one of the most consistent frustrations of my work is that I'm not allowed to test. No company has ever asked me to test. Does this punish poor people? Because poor class is not a protected class. So poor people being hurt by algorithms is a design feature. It's a real problem. I would say, Alex, that the only thing you can really assure of like with standards and consistencies is that. in terms of like what does it mean to be good enough or accurate enough? Like there is nothing. It's very frustrating. Martin, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I don't have the expertise to deal with the algorithm side of that question. So anything I say is going to be from ignorance. But I do think that in this, as in many of the questions we've touched on before, this is a moment where the tidal wave has hit the institutions, the city, the population, the public. And I think we are all kind of floundering around trying to figure out. And I think the question you asked, Alex, is to me the most profound one, which is not even institutions and it's not even democracy, but on a personal level. On a personal level, when you are doing a certain kind of work, what are you contributing to and what are you working against? And I say that, and I can look you in the virtual eye right now, and tell you that I am very thankful that I am not a young man, because it is hard. It is hard. I'm watching this happen. I have children about your age, from what I can tell. And it is hard. It is hard. Everybody does it in the end. You compromise. I guess that was always true to some extent. None of us were saints as we went through life. But it is, at least we knew what we were signing on to. It is hard. It is hard. We are in a moment of pretty complete. It's not just mathematical. It's not just political, but moral chaos.
Great. Well, listen, I only have 2 tasks left after this remarkable peroration at the end. One is to remind everyone of some of the upcoming events at Persuasion. We're going to have our weekly happy hour on Thursday starting at 5 p.m. And we will be having a great debate probably next Sunday, for we're still dealing with the details of the scheduling, about a series of articles that we're going to have coming out in the next few days. It will probably hit your inboxes on Tuesday, in which Michael Walzer, one of the most important contemporary political philosopher and a self-described democratic socialist who is a long-time editor of a leftist magazine, Dissent, is making the argument that we should not prosecute Donald Trump if he loses the election, because even though he may have committed crimes, that would send a bad precedent. And then Norm Ornstein, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, used to be more conservative, or he's been very critical of Donald Trump, arguing that no, actually we really should prosecute Donald Trump if he loses for crimes he has committed, because otherwise we would be setting a very bad precedent in the other direction. So I think that's a nice, perverse debate coming from 2 different sides. And we will have some people, hopefully including those 2, working on the scheduling details, debate that question, which I think is going to be really important. It's important to think through this issue. And the second task I have is simply to thank Kathy O'Neill and Martin Gurry for a wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Yasha.
Thank you.
Sorry about my Wi-Fi.